talk about the Malagueñas of two very influential singers, and this follows beautifully on Lauren's presentation, because these are the two, probably the most famous interpreters of Malagueña. And I think part of this is that La Trini does not really get the recognition that she deserves in the history of Malagueñas. Because if you look at the discography of Malagueñas, pretty much they'll either be Malagueña de Chacón or Malagueña de Mellizo. These are two of the most important or most influential singers. And I'd like to also talk about how this interacts with this notion of cante gitano versus cante andaluz, because there's an interesting way that this interacts. And first, I'd just like to say a little bit about cante gitano versus cante andaluz. This is a basic distinction that many people have talked about. Cante gitano are forms that are associated with gitano singers, traditionally. And these include tonás, martinetes, siguerías, soleares, tientos, tangos, bulerías. Whereas the cante andaluz are the forms that are claimed to be derived from Andalusian folkloric song forms. And there's a little bit of a controversy here because the other ones presumably also have something to do with Andalusian folkloric song forms. But the cante andaluz pretty much comes directly from forms of fandangos. So these would include the various types of fandangos, malagueñas, granainas, and cantes de levante. This distinction was actually discussed by Antonio Machado Alvarez, de Mofilo, back in the 19th century, and the distinction came to light again in this wonderful time of the Café Cantantes, where cante gitano and cante andaluz came together in a commercial setting. So they were, this was the development of flamenco in a commercial setting, and it brought some of these forms together. One of the controversies about it is that it sometimes suggests that the cante gitano was created in a hermetic gitano community, and this has been source of endless debate. And I'm not going to get into that debate, but I'd like to just note that, as Peter Manuel noted in one of his works, there is an objective basis for the distinction. The things that are classified as cante gitano tend to be more in the Phrygian mode, and the things that are cante andaluz tend to be more in the major key, and then resolving into the Phrygian mode. So there is some objective distinction, and whatever the basis of that distinction is historically is for another debate. So now going to Malagueñas. Malagueñas, as we heard, represented the first major flamenco form that was derived from regional fandangos. And it was based on fandangos from eastern Andalusia. And they were developed, as we just heard, as vocal showpieces by a succession of professional singers, which included Juan Breva, La Trini, Enrique del Mellizo, Antonio Chacón, El Canario, and Fosforito. The musical foundation is that they have major key verses that resolve into a related Phrygian mode. And you can see this here, the C major, where you alternate essentially between the tonic C and the tonic C and the dominant G. And then in the second line, you move up to the F, which is the subdominant here. And at the very end, at the very last line, then you go from the F and you resolve into an E, which takes you into the Phrygian mode. Historically, they had an abandolao rhythm, which is the typical Eastern fandangos rhythm that goes bum, tarum, tarum, bum, bum, tarum, tarum, tum, like that. And here we can hear an example of Juan Breva's 1910 recording of a Malagueña that shows all of this. There's the abandolao rhythm. The G, and then to the C, and then to the subdominant F, the G to the C, then it goes back to from the C to the G. And then from the G to the C. And now it's going to resolve to the F, and then go down a half step to the E. And there's the abandolao rhythm. So that's the musical foundation of pretty much all Malagueñas. In the Golden Age, as Lauren just pointed out, in the latter part of the 19th century, a good deal of the innovation in flamenco emerged in these commercial settings. And this again was where cante gitano and andaluz were performed in the same venues. And Malagueña essentially represented the most prototypical exponent of cante andaluz. It was the first thing that was really derived from these regional fandangos. Now, Malagueñas originally are based on these fandangos from the area of the province of Malaga, and several of the early innovators were in fact from the province of Malaga, including Breva, Canario, and Latrini, but others were from the province of Cádiz, which was more inside the flamenco triangle, and these included Enrique del Mellizo from Cádiz, Antonio Chacón from Jerez, and Fosprito also from Cádiz. The styles associated with Mellizo and Chacón remain the most influential. Hence, the Malagueñas have really lost their regional quality and become a pan-Andalusian palo, or flamenco form. Now, turning to Enrique del Mellizo, he was born in 1848. He was a Gitano from Cádiz, from the Gitano neighborhood of the Barrio Santa Maria. He was famous for having a rather peculiar personality. He wasn't really a professional singer per se. He sang in semi-professional venues. His actual work was working in the slaughterhouse, which a lot of the Gitanos at that time worked at. It was right adjacent to the Barrio Santa Maria. And there were stories about him going out at night and getting drunk and going and singing to the sea on the Campo del Sur in Cádiz, or he would go to Capuchinos, which was a psychiatric hospital, and he would sing for the inmates at the psychiatric hospital. And then also talk about him going after work, stopping at the church, which is just a few blocks away, the Nazareno, and listening to the choir practice. He is well known for his innovations in many of the cante gitano forms. So there's a Siguerías de Mellizo, there's a Soleá de Mellizo. A lot of the tientos were originally from Mellizo. However, he's also very well known for his Malagueña del Mellizo, a very distinctive style of Malagueña. Some have suggested influence of Gregorian chant, and that was part of the story of him going to the church after work and listening to the choir practice. However, others have disputed that, and it's probably the case that it may be overstated, because a lot of the features of the Malagueña del Mellizo that have been attributed to Gregorian chant are actually features that were developed by people after Mellizo. So the way he sang the Malagueña is not really the way people sing Malagueña del Mellizo now, and we'll see that in a minute. Nevertheless, he was credited as the first person to really dispense with the rhythm in Malagueña and create a truly free form of Malagueña. And would have happened around at least by the 1880s. I'm not sure when. He never recorded, and his Malagueña, therefore, is only known by latter interpreters. So we have to look at the historical record of people singing his style to see what it might have sounded like. And it has evolved over the last century. So what we hear now is the prototypical Malagueña Mellizo is not what it sounded like when he sang it. Jorge Martín Salazar, in his book on Malagueñas, suggests that his Malagueña may have sounded much have been much closer to the other Malagueñas sung at the time. The musical characteristics of the Malagueña, the first line is fairly simple. It usually hangs on a C. Sometimes it has a little ascension up to the C. The second line, and then the rest of the verse pretty much alternates between C and G, the tonic and the dominant. It doesn't really go to the subdominant at all until the last line resolves to A minor, and then there's this thing called an iao where they go I, and they do that throughout, descending through the Andalusian cadence. And that's really the hallmark of Malagueña de Mellizo now, is that descension through the Andalusian cadence. However, when we'll see, that wasn't always the case. But let's listen to Pericón, one of my favorite Cádiz singers, of course, singing a Malagueña Mellizo, and this is pretty much what you will always hear as a Malagueña Mellizo now. This is the Malagueña doble, because it has an extra I passage in the middle, as opposed to the Malagueña chica, which doesn't have that. So it's ascending up to the C. Just stands on that C. Still on the C. And then alternates to the G chord, and then go back to the C. This is the medial I passage, which is what makes this the doble. But it's still going back and forth between the tonic and the dominant. See, just still back and forth between those two chords. It's really fairly melodically simple. Here's the last line. It's going to resolve to A minor now. There's the A minor there. And now they'll go down the Andalusian cadence to G right here. To F. It now resolves to the E, to the Phrygian. So that final IAO is what really identifies this as a Malagueña de Mellizo for most people nowadays. However, it turns out that that wasn't always the case. So if we look at some of the early recordings of Malagueña, I'm going to just play the final line of all of these. And the earliest one was in 1898, and then going through the 20s. And you'll see the progression of the IAO in the development throughout the early 20th century. There's the A minor. And now it just kind of goes straight to the F and resolves to the E. And then the next one, 1908, A minor. Similarly, it doesn't go through the G. There's that A minor very clearly. It's longer, but it never really quite goes to the G. A minor. This is getting closer to the modern version, but it doesn't go to the G clearly. And now, A minor. There's a clear G now. F. And so with Aurelio, by the late 20s, we clearly have that modern IAO, which pretty much everyone does nowadays. Okay, now turning to Chacón, and he was also often known as Don Antonio Chacón because he was held in such regard. He had the title Don, which was not universal as it may be now. He was born in 1869. He was Payo, which means he was not Gitano. He was born in Jerez. He was the adopted son of a cobbler in La Plazuela de Jerez, and this was in the middle of one of the Gitano neighborhoods of Jerez. So he grew up surrounded by cante Gitano. He was discovered by Enrique del Mellizo at a party in 1886. And the story, which might be somewhat apocryphal, was that Mellizo walked up to him and was so impressed with the singing, he put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Young man, one day they're going to call you El Papa del Cante. They're going to call you the Pope of the pontiff of cante." He became something of a protege of Mellizo. He spent a lot of time in Cádiz. Mellizo invited him to perform in Cádiz, and his career really took off. And he became one of the most famous and respected singers in history, and is really responsible for the creation and the promotion of most of what's now referred to as cante andaluz, including Malagueñas, Granainas, and cantes de Levante. Now, he's also very, very famous for the Malagueñas. Malagueña de Chacón. He must clearly have been influenced by Mellizo, since he was such a close to Mellizo. And his Malagueñas, like Mellizo's, were libre. However, the melody is much different. It's much more ornate. It doesn't have the Mellizo really just goes back and forth between two chords, whereas his melodies actually are much closer to the original structure of the Juan Breva style Malagueñas, but are much more ornate. And they have clear similarities with the Malagueña de Latrini. In fact, we're going to hear an example where the melody is almost identical to the one we just heard of Latrini. There were probably 5 or 6 styles. People argue about how many styles you can associate with Chacón, but 5 is usually the the smaller number, and there's sometimes more. The musical characteristics, has a much wider melodic range. The first line is quite complex melodically. The second line, and we heard this with the video we just saw, the second line actually ends on a B flat, which suggests a passing tone to the subdominant. So actually a C sharp, C seventh chord. The B flat is in the C seventh chord. And the singer doesn't go to the F, but then the guitar goes to the F. And then the fairly rapid progression to the Phrygian at the very last, in the very end. And here's a 1909 recording of Antonio Chacón singing one of his varieties of Malagueña. So this is the first line. There's that B flat there. That's the seventh chord, and then the guitar goes to the F. There's the F to the E very quickly. So that's an example of one of the Chacón styles. Now it turns out that the cantes, the Malagueñas de Mellizo, were pretty marginal during the golden age Malagueñas. And this is probably because the principal Malagueñeros from that period, the cafe cantantes, the ones that performed professionally were Juan Breva, Latrini, El Canario, Chacón, and Fosforito. In fact, there is a long famous rivalry between Chacón and Fosforito in the cafe cantantes. And since Mellizo wasn't professional, he wasn't out there performing, and these other Malagueñeros were singing their own styles of Malagueña, so you didn't really hear Mellizo. So that he had less influence during this period. And in fact, looking at some of the discographic evidence, I looked at a database of about 3,000 cylinder and 78 recordings from the late 1800s through the 1950s. Of these, there were 224 Malagueñas, and I listened to them all. I did. And between 1898 and 1920, there were only 3 recordings that were Mellizo-style Malagueñas in this period. However, the Malagueñas de Mellizo began to emerge in the 1920s, which is interesting. And I think there's 2 reasons for this. And there was a 1923 recording by Manuel Vallejo, who was a very important and influential singer of the time. He recorded several styles of Malagueñas, but one of them was a Malagueña del Mellizo, which had the line La Mare Mia, and several others at that time sang that same Malagueña, which I believe was probably modeled on Vallejo, because Vallejo was an important, influential singer of the time. The other is Aurelio Selle, or Aurelio de Cádiz. He had 3 recordings of Malagueña de Mellizo in 1929. He was a protege of Mellizo. He was from the same barrio, Santa Maria as Mellizo, so he was a neighbor. He was not Gitano, he was Payo. In fact, he dated Mellizo's daughter, at least according to one biography. And he is regarded as the most faithful link between Mellizo and the modern Cádiz cante. So he sings all of the Cádiz cante in the style of Mellizo. And he was a well-known singer. He recorded. He was active professionally as a singer. 2 other links between Mellizo and the modern period are Mellizo's 2 sons, Antonio Mellizo and Enrique El Morcilla, but they were, again, semi-professional and didn't record, and so they were less influential outside of Cádiz. Inside of Cádiz, they were influential. So here's some some data from those recordings, you can see the number of Malagueña de Mellizo in the first 3 decades. There's one each decade, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. And then by the 20s, there's 5 out of 59, which is 20%. It goes up to 34% in the 30s, and then a pretty high percentage in the 40s and 50s, although the numbers of recordings in the database are small because this is when 78s are beginning to compete with other recording technology. So the 78s wouldn't be here. So you can see, though, an emergence of the Malagueña Mellizo that happened as a result probably of Vallejo and Aurelio Selle. Now, there's both a regional and an ethnic bias towards Malagueñas de Mellizo. The regional bias is that any singer from Cádiz, if they sing a Malagueña, it's going to be de Mellizo. I think I've heard one recording of Carmen de la Jara singing a Malagueña de Fosforito, because he was also from Cádiz. But every other recording from a Cádiz singer of a Malagueña will be a Malagueña de Mellizo. They essentially never sing Chacón Malagueñas. But there's also an ethnic bias, and this is that these styles have become associated with cante gitano. And so Gitano singers will tend to sing Malagueña de Mellizo more than they'll sing the other varieties of Malagueñas. So while they may be considered Malagueñas, on the one hand, prototypical cante andaluz, the Mellizo style has become a Gitano variety of the Malagueña. And this is similar to the fandangos de Caracol, for example, which are also performed widely by Gitano singers. And to look at this, I looked at about 90 LP recordings from the 1960s through the 1980s, and I pretty much looked at all of the major singers from that time. And these recordings happen to have 18 Gitano singers, 6 Payo singers, and I excluded all the singers from Cádiz because I knew they were going to sing Malagueña de Mellizo, and it would skew the data. There were 42 Malagueñas, which is interesting. That shows that Malagueñas is not a widely recorded form, like 1 out of every 2 LPs. About half of them were Mellizo, 22, and the other half were not, and probably mainly Chacón. But if you look at the Gitano singers, 20 out of the 25 Malagueñas were Mellizo. So 80% of the Malagueñas that the Gitanos were recording were Mellizo. Only 3 out of the 18 among Payo singers was Mellizo. And last thing is very interesting. If you look at the Jerez singers, now you expect flamenco has a very strong regional bias. Antonio Chacón was from Jerez. He was from La Pazuela. You would expect a singer from Jerez to identify with Antonio Chacón. But all of the Jerez singers in this sample, and they were all Gitanos, 7 out of 9 recorded Malagueña de Mellizo and not Malagueña de Chacón. So the ethnic bias seems to have trumped the regional bias in this case. And I just the other day saw an article in the Diario de Jerez about Diego Agujetas, talking about his life and talking about cante. And he talked about how nobody likes the real cante anymore, and he sings the real cante, the Sigarias, the Soleá, the Malagueña. And I thought it was interesting that he included Malagueña there. And then he later in the interview said that his brother Manuel Agujetas told him that if he sang Malagueñas, he'd ruin his voice. So there is some identification, even among the Agujetas, which are probably the family of cante Gitano singers par excellence nowadays, some association with Malagueña. So just to conclude, Malagueñas were the prototypical cante andaluz. Mellizo played a very influential role, but the influence was not apparent during the early period and only emerged later in the 1920s. And then currently, Malagueña de Mellizos are associated both with Cádiz, the regional bias, and Gitano singers, the ethnic bias. Thank you.